All right, welcome to U.S. History. This is for Chapter 6, and you can tell the video is a little more relaxed. You've got an assignment, that's mandatory, make sure you do that. And then this video is for those of you that just want to see the video clips that we will see in class, just a little extra learning, a little extra entertainment, or if you need help with kind of the bigger picture, the overview of things that are going on. So real quick, let me talk about Chapter 5. In Chapter 5, we had 13 individual colonies and things, there was a protagonist. England is causing friction, and that friction heats them up and they're becoming one country. So we're moving from, it's unity. That was the theme of Chapter 5, moving from 13 individual colonies to sort of a unified group, okay? And you should be able to list 3 or 4 causes of this friction, causes of the Revolutionary War. In Chapter 6, we're talking Revolutionary War. At first, it's not really a full war, it's just we want respect. It's not a full revolution, but now it's going to steamroll and it's going to be a war, okay? So let's get into it. Let's talk about the Declaration of Independence. Who writes it? Thomas Jefferson. What does he say? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Where does he get that from? Remember from the Enlightenment? John Locke said what? Life, liberty, property. Okay, so Thomas Jefferson is sort of bringing John Locke in. Does that make sense? Okay, hopefully it does. I also want to talk to you about this, the difference between the American Revolution and the Revolutionary War. Okay, so the American Revolution is more of the set of ideas, and the Revolutionary War is the actual. This is advanced. If you're getting confused, just let it go over your head. But if you can just listen and try to understand, the Revolutionary War, that's the actual war. The American Revolution is the concept that we shouldn't have a king. We shouldn't have nobility. Everyone should be equal and equal under the law. And we should use reason to govern. Okay, so you'll read about Thomas Paine. He has a pamphlet that says common sense. Well, why is the king in England the king? Because his daddy was the king. Does that make him the best person for the job? Probably not. What makes you the best person for the job is usually, something intellectual or perhaps, personal or emotional, whatever. We can use our brains and figure out who the best person is. That's who should rule us, okay? Not just because your dad and his dad had the job. Does that make sense? Okay, that's the American Revolution, that we're moving towards freedom. Okay, the Revolutionary War, that's from 1775 to 1783. And let's talk about advantages, disadvantages. The British Army, they're a professional army, okay? So they're gonna have that advantage, but they're far away. And so you gotta supply them, things like that. America's #1 advantage is we don't have to win, we just don't have to, we can't lose. Like what I'm saying is, we can wait them out. We have the home field advantage. So A, we know the land, but B, we're not going anywhere. The longer it drags on, then the better it is for us, if that makes sense. Okay, just don't give up and you'll win. There's 4 battles I want you to know about: the Battle of Long Island, the Battle of Trenton, the Battle of Saratoga, and Yorktown. Okay, Battle of Long Island, George Washington's almost captured. This thing's almost over before it starts. But the fog rolls in and he sneaks out the back and he disappears. Without that fog, you might not have a United States. Isn't that nuts? By the way, if I ever wrote a book one day, one of my book ideas is how weather changed history. There's a time when the Mongols would have invaded Japan, but the tsunami takes them out. Like, there's these weather events that have dramatic effects on history. This is one of them. Battle of Trenton. The Americans are losing, but we're going to sneak across in the middle, Christmas Eve and attack the Hessians, and we're going to get a win. It doesn't mean we won the war, but it's like a football score. Maybe you're down 28-0. The Battle of Trenton, you put some points on the board. Now you're down 28-7, something like that. The Battle of Saratoga is the turning point of the war. This is where France is going to finally come in and help out. Okay, so you need to know about the Battle of Saratoga, the Battle of Trenton, Battle of Long Island, and the last one, Yorktown. This is where they surrender, and once they surrender, it's party time, right? Okay, kind of. got a video clip about the turtle. You'll watch that. You'll love that. Okay, so here are the video clips for this chapter. I hope you enjoy. Take care.
Dr. Rhys Morgan is at the Royal Navy Submarine Museum in Gosport, England, uncovering information about a secret weapon from the Revolutionary War.
And this is it, the Turtle, the first submersible used in recorded underwater combat. Bushnell's plan for the Turtle was to sneak up on the British enemy ships moored in New York Harbor. The vessel had lots of weights in it to help it sink into the water, and underneath the base there was a ballast tank which would be filled with water. And the operator, a man called Ezra Lee, would pump the water in and out of the tank to help sink to the right depth.
As the Turtle slips underwater, its two surface-mounted snorkels seal. The pilot powers the craft using a hand-cranked front-mounted propeller. As he approaches his target, he readies the Turtle's weapon.
The Turtle's weapon, a keg of gunpowder, was attached to the back of the wooden hull. As the submarine silently crept up underwater to the base of the ships, it would be attached by this drill, which would be literally hand-drilled into the base of the ship.
Unfortunately for the pilot, Ezra Lee, the British fleet had metal hulls.
By sheer bad luck, Ezra Lee wasn't able to drill into the ship's hull, so the Turtle was a bit of a failure. But having said that, it did set the precedent for submersible combat, and the principles of ballast, tanks, and propulsion still to this day remain on all submarines.
To understand how the Pennsylvania became the world's most powerful killing machine, we must travel back in time. Our journey begins in 1776 with the world's first war submarine, a hollow wooden sphere with a limited supply of air. At the height of the American War of Independence, the Americans find themselves at a severe disadvantage. Their warships are no match for the might of the British Navy. They hatch a plan that relies on guile rather than brute force. Their scheme requires a new kind of vessel, one that allows a man to carry a bomb underwater. Man and bomb must remain hidden until they reach the British battleship. Once there, the man has to plant the bomb and escape. And he must do it all without coming up for air. On the night of the attack, engineers attach a bomb to the Turtle's back. They tie the bomb to a drill head that can be driven into the hull of the enemy ship. But when the operator reaches his target, he finds the underside of the British ship is lined with copper sheeting. Try as he might, the drill is unable to pierce it, and he can't attach the bomb. Over 2 centuries ago, the Turtle's operator could stay submerged for just 25 minutes. The American engineers build their craft from 2 hollowed-out pieces of solid oak. Just like a barrel, they use iron hoops to hold the 2 halves together and seal the join with tar to keep the water out. A tank sits below the operator. When he pumps it full of seawater, the craft sinks. Hidden underwater, the operator now sits in his own bubble of air. It's the world's first war submarine. They call it the Turtle.
The Patriot victories at Trenton and Princeton stung the British, but they were still confident of success. British officers worked out a detailed plan for 1777, which they believed would lead them to victory. What did this plan entail? The plan involved 3 separate British armies and perfect timing. Johnny Burgoyne would lead 8,000 troops from Canada, while a separate force under Barry St. Leger would move east from Ontario. The third group, General Howe's main army, would move north from New York City. The 3 British armies would converge at Albany, cut off New England from the other colonies, and destroy the Patriot Army. From the outset, the British plan began to unravel. Howe never committed to the plan, focusing instead on capturing the Patriot capital of Philadelphia, which he did in September of 1777. Rather than moving north to join Burgoyne, Howe camped his army in Philadelphia for the winter. The second British force, under Barry St. Leger, was turned back by Patriot forces under the command of Benedict Arnold. This left Burgoyne's army plodding along through the dense New York forest all alone. He managed to recapture Fort Ticonderoga, but trouble soon followed. Loaded down with 30 extra wagons to support his lavish lifestyle, his army moved at a lagging pace. His soldiers, in their bright red uniforms, also became an easy target for colonists who tormented his movements. In need of food and supplies, Burgoyne retreated towards Saratoga, New York. While Burgoyne sat back, awaiting the arrival of the British armies, American troops under the command of Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold closed in around them. Realizing he was about to be trapped, Burgoyne launched a devastating attack that resulted in some of the most intense fighting of the war. While the Americans were driven back, Burgoyne's situation only worsened as colonial militia closed in behind his army, severing the supply lines. After 17 days of the 2 armies staring each other down, the real fighting at Saratoga began with a desperate British attempt to break through the American lines. Defying orders from General Gates, Benedict Arnold seized control and led an assault on the exposed British camp. Shouting, "Victory or death!" Arnold led the Patriots forward as they crushed through the British lines, sending Burgoyne running off the battlefield with bullet holes in his hat and jacket, his horse having been shot out from beneath him. The attack let up only after Arnold lay on a stretcher, a bullet having crushed through the same leg that had been wounded in the assault on Quebec. With no other options, the British began their retreat. After marching less than 8 miles in 24 hours, they found their escape route cut off by New Hampshire militia. On October 17, 1777, for the first time, an entire army of British soldiers surrendered to an American army. The Battle of Saratoga is seen as the turning point of the Revolutionary War. Thus, it is quite possibly the most important battle of the war.
It is December 19th, 1777. Now that means that the American Revolution has already been waging for over 2.5 years. It's been a year and a half since the Americans in Philadelphia had officially declared independence from the British at the Pennsylvania State House, which is Independence Hall today. Since then, things have not been going well for General Washington's army here in Pennsylvania. The British up in New York City send an invasion fleet down into the Chesapeake. They land an army in Maryland. That army marches up into Pennsylvania. Its goal is to capture Philadelphia, the biggest city in America in those days, which was a sprawling metropolis of barely 30,000 people. The British succeed. They defeat Washington at the Battle of Brandywine, one of the biggest battles of the war. They defeat a portion of his army at the Battle of Paoli. They capture 2 American forts, Fort Mifflin and Fort Mercer, along the Delaware, and they're able to occupy Philadelphia. Congress has fled. They're in exile over in Yorktown. Today we call it York, Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania's executive council, their rebel government, the state government, has fled as well. They're over in Reading right now. Thousands of other Philadelphia residents are now refugees out in the countryside. Washington tries one last time to force the British out of Philadelphia before they're able to dig in by launching a surprise attack at Germantown, and fails, and is forced to retreat. The British are dug in, winter is setting in, the weather is getting worse, and Washington's army is exhausted. The men are tired, the equipment is worn out. Washington needs to find a place to regroup, refit, and plan his next move. And he chooses Valley Forge. This location, this farming community out here, named after an iron forge that was located in a nearby valley, was only about 20 miles outside of the city of Philadelphia, close enough to the British to contain them and bottle them up in the city and protect the countryside and its resources, but also just far away enough so if the British attacked, they could see it coming, and on high ground that could provide a good defensive position. And while this army is here, they have to struggle through difficult months of regrowth and rebuilding. Their supply system collapses. Supply shortages, food, clothing, blankets become ever present. And disease runs rampant. This is one of the deadliest encampments of the war. More soldiers end up dying at Valley Forge than in any single battle during the Revolution. And yet, this was also a much-needed opportunity for Washington to reorganize the army and train and reform it, using the assistance of other officers like General Knox, General Greene, General von Steuben. They proceed to do a top-down restructuring of this army. So that by the time the army leaves Valley Forge, months later, on June 19th, 1778, in spite of all the hardship, in spite of all the death that they encountered here, they're actually stronger, better trained, and better organized than they've ever been. After they leave here, they chase the British through New Jersey and engage the British at the Battle of Monmouth. That is not the end of the war, though. This war is going to wage for another 5 years. But a lot of the organizing and restructuring and reforms that they do here are going to allow this army to survive and continue for those next 5 years. I really think Washington's greatest victory of this war was not the surrender of Cornwallis at Yorktown. It's the fact that he was able to keep this army alive and functioning for 8 years. That is the battle that he fought at Valley Forge, and it is why places like this are so important in that conflict story.
When the war began, most people believed that the British Navy would crush the undermanned American fleet. The Continental Navy used fewer than 100 ships throughout the war, but captured or destroyed over 200 British vessels. How did the Patriot Navy manage such success? Much of the success was due to a man now known as the father of the United States Navy. A Scotsman by birth, John Paul began working on British ships at a young age. After killing the leader of a mutiny, John Paul became an outlaw. He changed his name to John Paul Jones and fled to the American colonies. When the war broke out, Jones quickly established himself as a bold and clever sailor. The British considered him a pirate, as his tactics primarily revolved around raiding commerce ships. In early 1778, Jones captured 7 British ships and defeated a Royal Navy sloop in English waters. "Where is the British Navy?" an English newspaper declared. Yet Jones had only begun. When France formally recognized the United States, Benjamin Franklin arranged for Jones to receive a much larger ship from the new Allies. In fact, the French greatly admired Jones and presented him with a fleet of 7 vessels to command. Jones named his flagship Bonhomme Richard, in honor of Benjamin Franklin's Poor Richard's Almanac. The Richard carried 40 cannons, and a crew of 380 men that hailed from 11 different nations. With his new fleet, Jones tore through the English waters, capturing 17 merchant ships and 500 prisoners. The British people were in an uproar, but Jones' most famous moment was yet to come. On September 23, 1779, Jones launched a moonlight attack on a convoy protected by a British frigate, the HMS Serapis, and a sloop, the HMS Countess of Scarborough. When the British captain spotted Jones, he ordered the convoy to flee, while the warships raced to attack the Richard. Jones knew he was in trouble, but refused to run. The Serapis had more and bigger cannons, along with copper sheathing, which made the vessel faster than Jones's ship. Thousands of British gathered along the coast to watch the battle, and Jones put on a show. The Serapis launched a devastating attack which killed most of Jones' men and knocked out all but 3 of his guns. Many of Jones' officers begged him to surrender, and one made a rush to strike the Richard's flag, which was a signal of surrender. Jones clobbered the man with a pistol, rendering him unconscious. Jones, who had been manning one of his 3 remaining cannons, brought the Richard around and rammed the Serapis in an attempt to board it. As the ships locked together, the captain of the Serapis shouted, "Has your ship struck?" Jones roared back, "I have not yet begun to fight," as he blasted another cannon at the Serapis's main mast. One of Jones' topmen eventually crawled onto the Serapis and dropped a grenade into the powder supply, setting off an explosion that knocked out all but 4 of the British cannons. It was still one more than Jones had, but the action convinced the British captain that he had no hope of defeating the stubborn Scotsman. The Serapis surrendered to John Paul Jones. As the Bonhomme Richard sank, Jones sailed the captured Serapis to Holland to be repaired. Today, the remains of John Paul Jones are entombed at the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland.
Walt Disney presents From Frontierland, The Swamp Fox. The Birth of the Swamp Fox. Starring Leslie Nielsen.
I've had enough of this. Even bloodhounds couldn't catch that swamp fox in country like this. Come with me.
Swamp Fox. That's what Tarleton called me. And I'm much obliged to him for the idea, because we'll hole up here by day and we'll strike by night.
In the spring of 1780, when Colonel Francis Marion first came to prominence, America's war for independence seemed all but lost. Washington's hard-pressed army was deteriorating in New Jersey, waiting for reinforcements from General Lafayette. But the French were bottled up by a British fleet standing off the mouth of Narragansett Bay. Down at Charleston, General Lincoln and his colonial army faced imminent attack by land and sea, and royal garrisons had already been established along the Carolina frontier from Rocky Mount to the Atlantic. Along this line, it was the enemy's plan to divide the colonies and conquer them one part at a time. Suddenly, to the surprise of Cornwallis, his communications were cut, his supply trains were intercepted, and isolated outpost garrisons were destroyed. In this darkest hour of his country's need, the Swamp Fox had been born. And he and his hardy band of freedom fighters were on the move. To the American patriots who lived and fought throughout those uncertain days, Colonel Marion was a hero second only to George Washington. Even after the fighting ended and our new nation began to expand westward, the legend of the Swamp Fox was told and retold around 1,000 campfires. The result today is that there are 17 counties and 29 cities and towns scattered throughout the United States that proudly bear the name of Marion. Now, this is the first of several stories we will bring you about the daring adventures of America's Robin Hood of the Revolution, the Swamp Fox. Its title, The Birth of the Swamp Fox.
Now we know why the enemy fleet has been laying in Charleston Harbor all these weeks without firing a shot.
Of course. While we watch the sea, they make a surprise attack by land.
More likely a combined land and sea attack, Sergeant Jasper. How many marching hours are we from Charleston?
12, maybe less.
It's all the time we've got. About troop, Sergeant.
About troop, oh!
Where's the general?
In his quarters. Why?
Come along and find out.
Hope you had a good reason for waking me up in the middle of the night.
I believe I have, sir. A large enemy force is less than 5 hours' march from here. They'll have us cut off by daybreak.
5 hours. Are you sure of your information, Colonel?
Saw it with my own eyes, sir. This explains why the fleet hasn't attacked. They've been waiting for land support. They'll probably throw a force across the Charleston Peninsula and then lay siege. I suggest we evacuate immediately, sir, before we're trapped.
Now, let's not be hasty, Colonel. I must have time to think this out. Call an officers' assembly, Major R.E., please.
I'm sorry, sir, but there aren't 3 officers left in the fort outside the sick bay.
Well, where are they?
McKellar's. He's giving a big party, and they all went.
Then they're celebrating their own deaths. Who gave them leave?
I did. Things were quiet. I thought it would be good for the morale.
McKellar is probably thinking about morale, too, sir, in another way. With your permission, sir, this is one party I'd like to break up.
Today, it is recognized that the Declaration of Independence excluded many Americans. The document declared that all men are created equal, but it did not mention women. Although the document failed to address women's rights, many women were patriots. Who were some of these women? Abigail Adams did attempt to influence her husband when the Declaration of Independence was being written. In a letter to John Adams, she wrote, "Remember the ladies, and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power in the hands of the husbands. If particular attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion, and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." Judith Sargent Murray was another woman who, inspired by the Revolution, began to question women's historical place in society. In an essay on education, she argued that a woman's mind was as good as any man's, and that girls should receive the same education as boys. This was an extremely radical argument at the time, as most girls received little or no schooling at all. Women in the 18th century were not expected to express opinions about complicated topics such as politics and war. Mercy Otis Warren was an outspoken exception. Prior to the Revolution, Warren published plays and poems ridiculing British authority in Massachusetts. She also urged colonists to resist British infringements on colonial rights and liberties. In 1805, she published one of the first histories of the War for Independence, entitled History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution. While Abigail Adams, Judith Murray, and Mercy Otis Warren used pens to argue for change, others took a more active approach to fight for liberty. Hundreds, often accompanied by children, followed the armies to cook and clean for officers and their husbands. Many served as nurses. These women were known by the nickname Molly Pitcher. On multiple occasions, women fought in battle. The most well-known was Mary Ludwig Hayes Macaulay, whose husband served in General Washington's artillery. In the 1778 Battle of Monmouth, with the temperature close to 100 degrees, she ran back and forth between the lines, bringing water to her husband's battery. When her husband was wounded, she assumed his place in the gun crew. During the battle, a British cannonball passed between her knees, ripping away part of her petticoat. According to various first-hand accounts, Mary continued on unfazed, loading the gun with as much regularity as any soldier present. Margaret Corbin was another Molly Pitcher who assumed her husband's place in battle. When her husband was killed during the British assault on Fort Washington in 1777, she rushed to fill the position. She was soon struck by 3 bullets, leaving her unable to use her left arm. Another woman, 22-year-old Deborah Sampson, disguised herself as a boy and enlisted in the Continental Army. After being wounded, she managed to conceal her identity until a second stint in the hospital led to a doctor discovering her gender. She was honorably discharged. Macaulay, Corbin, and Sampson all received military pensions from Congress for their service during the Revolutionary War.